You're standing in a store. In your hand is something small, a face cream, a book, a candle, a piece of clothing you've wanted for 3 months. It fits your budget. You can afford it. You have earned the money that would pay for it with your own time, your own energy, your own weeks of showing up and doing the work and coming home and doing it again. And yet, before the purchase even happens, something arrives first. A voice, not quite audible but completely present, running its quiet calculation before you've even decided anything. Is this necessary? Shouldn't that money go somewhere else? The kids need something. There's a bill coming. What if something unexpected happens? What would people think? Am I being irresponsible? And then the one that lands heaviest, the one underneath all the others. Am I being selfish? You put it back. Or you buy it and carry the guilt home with it, folded inside the bag like a receipt you didn't ask for, one that charges you long after the transaction is done. Now picture a woman in Kyoto making the exact same decision. Same item. Same price relative to her income. Same moment of consideration. She picks it up, holds it for a moment, not with anxiety, not with a running internal tribunal, but with the calm, deliberate attention of someone simply deciding whether a thing belongs in her life right now. It does. She already knew that, actually, before she walked in. She buys it. She carries it home. No voice. No calculation. No guilt waiting at the door when she gets there. The difference between these two women is not confidence, not income, not personality. It is a concept so quietly embedded in Japanese culture that most Japanese women couldn't name it if you asked them. They simply live it. The concept is called Jibin no Tamenai. It translates directly as for my own sake, and it is the philosophical foundation underneath a relationship with self-spending that the Western world has spent generations conditioning women out of. Stay with this, because by the end, you'll have 3 specific shifts that make the guilt not smaller, but structurally impossible. Where the guilt actually comes from. To understand why the guilt exists, you have to go back further than your last purchase. Further than your mother's voice. Further even than the specific moments you remember being told to put someone else first. The conditioning runs deep in Western, and particularly American, culture, a set of values built, historically, around a very specific idea of what a good woman looked like. She was selfless. She gave. She put her family first, her children first, her partner first, her community first, and what remained, if anything remained after all of that, was hers. This was not presented as a sacrifice. It was presented as virtue, as love made visible, as proof of character. And virtue, when it is repeated enough times and rewarded enough times and reflected back at you by everyone around you, stops feeling like a role and starts feeling like identity. You stop noticing that you are performing selflessness and begin to genuinely believe that selflessness is simply who you are. That wanting things for yourself is a deviation from your real self, not an expression of it. Psychologists who study emotional labor, the invisible, uncounted, largely unacknowledged work of managing other people's needs, feelings, comfort, and well-being, have documented extensively that women are socialized from childhood to perform this labor as a default, not a choice. It is expected without being requested. It is noticed only in its absence. And the woman who fails to perform it is not described as someone who prioritized herself. She is described with a word that cuts: selfish. The consequence of this conditioning over time is not just exhaustion. It is a psychological rewiring so thorough that spending on others produces a warm sense of rightness, love expressed, virtue confirmed, while spending on yourself produces the opposite. A low, familiar wrongness. The feeling of taking something that doesn't quite belong to you, even when it clearly does. This is not a character flaw. It is the intended result of a cultural system that needed women to give more than they kept for a very long time, and that encoded that requirement so deeply it now arrives as an emotion rather than an instruction. You don't hear the rule anymore. You feel the guilt. And guilt, unlike rules, is very hard to argue with. The woman in the store who put the item back didn't make a financially responsible decision. She obeyed a voice that was never hers to begin with and mistook obedience for virtue one more time. What Japan built instead, Japanese culture is not free of expectations placed on women. That is not the claim. But within Japanese domestic life, something developed that runs quietly counter to the guilt script, the understanding that a woman who is depleted cannot give from a place of genuine care, and that maintaining yourself, your energy, your comfort, your inner life is not a luxury. It is a responsibility. Jibun no Tamenai, for my own sake, carries within it the assumption that the self is a legitimate recipient of one's own care and resources, not instead of others, alongside others. The self is not last on the list. The self is part of the list. This connects to a broader Japanese concept called Jiko Kanri, self-management, self-stewardship. In the Japanese framework, taking care of yourself is not indulgence. It is maintenance of the most important resource you have. The same principle that leads a Japanese household to care for objects with attention and respect, not discarding things before their time, not neglecting what has value, applies to the person living in that household. You are not exempt from your own care. You are, in fact, where all care begins. There is also the cultural practice of kansha, deep gratitude, the felt acknowledgement of what you have and what you are capable of, woven into how Japanese women approach self-spending. When a woman buys something for herself intentionally, with full awareness of what it is and why she wants it, the act carries a quiet gratitude. She is not grasping. She is receiving. The distinction matters neurologically. Receiving from a place of genuine acknowledgement feels different and registers differently than taking from a place of guilt that hasn't finished arguing with itself. The result is a woman who, when she spends on herself, has already decided clearly, before the purchase, what she needs and why it matters. And a decision made in advance with intention has no room left for guilt to enter afterward. Mindset Shift 1. You are a source, not a server. The first shift is not a trick. It is a reframe so fundamental that everything else depends on it. The guilt model positions you as a server, someone whose purpose is to distribute resources to others, and who has no legitimate claim on those resources for herself. In this model, spending on yourself is always a diversion from the real purpose of your money. The Jibun no Tamenai model positions you as a source. And a source that is never replenished eventually runs dry. This is not metaphor. It is what caregiving professionals call source depletion, the documented phenomenon in which people who give consistently without restoring themselves become less capable of genuine care over time, not more. The self-sacrifice is not sustainable, and eventually it costs the people it was meant to serve. When you spend on yourself intentionally, on rest, on beauty, on the book that restores your curiosity, on the item that makes the ordinary Tuesday feel considered, you are not taking from others. You are maintaining the source. This reframe doesn't require you to become someone who doesn't care about others. It requires you to understand that caring well, over time, requires that you also exist as someone cared for. Jiko Kanri, self-stewardship, starts here. You are worth maintaining. Not eventually. Not after everyone else is handled. Now, as part of the same budget that cares for everything else. Mindset Shift 2. The guilt was learned, which means it can be unlearned. Honest question. When was the last time you bought something just for yourself, with no justification prepared, no guilt waiting on the other side? Drop it in the comments. I want to know how long it's been. The second shift is the most uncomfortable one because it asks you to look directly at something most people prefer to treat as just how they are. The guilt is not how you are. It is what you were taught. And the reason this distinction matters is that identity feels permanent and conditioning is not. Conditioning is a pattern, a neural pathway worn smooth by repetition until it runs automatically. And like any pattern, it can be interrupted not by willpower, but by conscious substitution, practiced until the new path runs as smoothly as the old one. The interruption begins with a single practice. Before any self-purchase that triggers the guilt reflex, pause and name the voice. Not dismiss it, name it. This is the conditioning. This is the voice that was placed here. Then ask the actual question, does this purchase serve my genuine well-being? Is it within what I have? Did I decide in advance that this kind of spending belongs in my life? If the answers are yes, the purchase is not selfish. It is intentional. And intentional is the only standard that matters. Japanese women don't avoid the consideration, they front-load it. The decision is made deliberately, before the store, before the moment of temptation or guilt. What do I need this month for myself? What restores me? What would make this ordinary life feel more like mine? Those questions, answered in advance and recorded with the same attention given to any other budgeted category, mean that when the moment of purchase arrives, there is no trial to run. The decision is already made. The guilt has no opening. Mindset shift 3. Self-investment has a return. The third shift moves the conversation from permission to strategy because Jibin no Tame and I is not simply about feeling good. It is about what intentional self-investment produces over time. A woman who never spends on herself, whose budget has no category for her own restoration and pleasure, makes a specific set of financial decisions across time. She overspends emotionally, impulse purchases on hard days, retail therapy that is neither retail nor therapy, buying for others as a proxy for never buying for herself. She underinvests in her own growth, the course, the tool, the resource that would actually build her capacity. And she accumulates a low-level, permanent financial resentment, the sense that money moves through her life without any of it being truly hers. The Japanese approach gives self-spending a legitimate place in the monthly plan. Not unlimited, not indulgent. A specific, considered category that says, this amount, this month, is for me. When that category exists, the emotional spending drops. The impulse purchases that were filling a void no longer have a void to fill. The resentment dissolves because the budget reflects a woman who counts herself in, not out. The return on intentional self-investment is not always financial, but it is always real and always traceable. You make better decisions from restoration than from depletion, clearer, calmer, less reactive. You give more genuinely from fullness than from obligation, with actual warmth rather than the performance of warmth from someone who has nothing left. You spend less impulsively when your own needs have a legitimate category, because the emotional void that impulse spending was filling has been addressed at the source rather than papered over with purchases that were never really about the thing being purchased. And the version of you who has been counted into her own financial life, who has a budget line with her name on it, who spends on herself with intention and without apology, is, consistently and measurably, more financially stable than the version of you who has been spending from guilt, saving from shame, and giving from a place that was never replenished. This is what Jibin no Tame and I actually means when it lands in real life. Not treat yourself as a slogan. Not permission to spend recklessly or to stop caring about others. The deliberate, advanced decision, made in a notebook, in a quiet moment, before the store and before the voice, that you are a legitimate and non-negotiable part of your own financial picture. With a category. With a consideration. With the quiet, permanent absence of a voice that was placed there by someone else's framework, and that you have, finally, decided to stop running. The permission you were never given. You have been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to tell you that spending on yourself is allowed, not justified, not earned through sufficient sacrifice or measured against how much you have already given. Simply allowed, as a natural, unremarkable part of being a person who exists and matters and has legitimate needs that don't require a defense to be real. Consider this that moment. The woman in Kyoto didn't receive a special dispensation from guilt. She didn't find a loophole or develop an unusually thick skin. She grew up inside a framework that simply never installed the guilt the same way, a framework where Jibin no tame and I, for my own sake, was understood from childhood as a complete sentence, not a sentence that required justification attached to the end of it. She didn't have to unlearn the voice because the voice was never placed there with the same authority. You grew up inside a different framework. But frameworks are not fates. They are starting conditions. And the distance between a starting condition and a current reality is exactly the width of a decision, made repeatedly, until the new pathway runs as automatically as the old one did. The 3 shifts above are not techniques for feeling less guilty. They are the structural dismantling of the conditions that make guilt possible. When you reframe yourself as a source rather than a server, the guilt loses its moral authority. When you name the conditioning as conditioning rather than character, the guilt loses its claim on your identity. When you build intentional self-investment into the plan in advance, the guilt loses its timing. It arrives to find the decision already made, the category already funded, the purchase already belonging to a version of you who counted herself in. Buy the thing that was already decided. Carry it home without the voice. Open next month's budget and write a line that has your name on it, not at the bottom, not as a remainder after everyone else is handled, but as a fixed, non-negotiable category that exists because you exist, and that is enough of a reason. Not as a reward. Not as a treat. As a right that was always yours, and that no voice, however familiar, however long it has been running, ever had the actual authority to take away. If this said something you've needed to hear for a long time, share it with one woman who has spent years putting herself last and calling it love. It is time she read this. This content is for educational and informational purposes, exploring cultural philosophy and behavioral psychology. It does not constitute professional mental health or financial advice.